Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today, I'm here with my friend Matthieu. He is a French Catholic apologist, but also he's been expanding into areas concerning, I guess, in general, moral theology, right, but ethics, and especially the issue of abortion, which we are here to talk about today. So, Matthieu, talk to me about this book that you've been working on. I know that you already have one. Is this the first or second book of yours?
Yeah, this is the second book. I wrote my first book on Catholic apologetics in general. So proofs of God's existence, mere Christianity, and arguing in favor of Catholicism. This is my first book that's coming out in January or February. And the second book I'm currently writing at the moment is on pro-life apologetics. So rational arguments against abortion. And so, yeah, it's a distinct domain of apologetics, but it's still very important.
Yeah, and well, today, Matthieu, you have a presentation ready to discuss pro-life apologetics. And so I'll let you pull that presentation up. But yeah, I mean, I agree that there are implications for sexual morality based on the abortion debate. But I also think that, there's obviously a very strong feminist concern where women feel as if their autonomy is being taken away. But this has the consequence, right, of viewing children as burdens, which is something that I would never condone. A child is never a burden. But anyway, well, I mean, the child can be a financial, physical burden, but that doesn't have any bearing on their moral worth and dignity. So they're never just a burden.
Yeah, exactly. So if it's okay with you, I can start the presentation. So in this presentation, I use a lot of material from guys like Trent Horn, Christopher Kaiser, and also Randy Alcorns. I put their books at the end for recommendations. So a lot of material is from them. And I'm going to be using them for this PowerPoint. So the goal of this presentation is by no means to accuse or condemn women who have had an abortion. We do not judge people, but their actions in themselves. A person cannot be reduced to an act that he or she has committed in the past. And many women who have had an abortion in the past have done this without realizing the implications of their act. Some are even urged by their family members to have an abortion, even though they would like to keep the child. So really, this is not something to condemn or judge women, but rather to make people aware of the moral implications of abortion through rational inquiry. So if you're pro-choice, I would really hope you'll be open-minded with this presentation and that you listen carefully to the arguments that I will give and be prepared to change your mind if these arguments are successful, right? This is what we call open-mindedness. Okay, so first we should define our terms. So yeah, what is abortion? That's the central question. Before trying to figure out whether abortion is immoral or not, we have to figure out what abortion is. So here's a simple definition. Abortion is the direct and intentional killing of the human fetus or embryo. Pro-choicers admit this. Nathan Nobis and Christina Grove also define abortion as being an intentional killing of a fetus to the end of a pregnancy. These are pro-choice philosophers who have written the book Thinking Critically About Abortions. They admit this definition. So it's important to note that abortion is not just the ending of a pregnancy, because if that were the case, then a C-section would be an abortion, because when you do a C-section, you're literally ending a pregnancy by getting the baby out of the womb. So the term ending of the pregnancy is not sufficient to describe abortion. The intentional part in the definition is very important because medical procedures that remove the fallopian tube with the embryos in ectopic pregnancies are not abortion because you don't intend for the embryo to die. So this is why the intentional part is important. And the goal of abortion is to kill the child, because if the child survives, then we say that the abortion has failed. So this proves that the initial goal of abortion is to end the fetus's life. So with that said, we can go to a few statistics. So there are approximately 42 to 53 million abortions performed each year. Of those abortions, they are mainly performed by women who are under the age of between the age of 20 to 29, and 50% of women who have had an abortion have already had a previous abortion. And 30% of women aged 45 have had an abortion at least once in their lives. Right. Why do women have abortions? This is an important question to ask. So there was a survey done a few years ago that asked women why they chose to have an abortion, and women could choose to respond with one or more reasons. And the reasons that were given were the following. So having a baby would drastically change my life, 74%. I don't have enough money to have a baby now, 73%. I don't want to be a single mother. I have relationship problems. I have already done having my children. I don't want them anymore. And the only the hard cases like rape and incest are only about 1% of abortions that are performed. That's not a huge number, and we need to stress this out, because there are pro-choice people who will say, oh, their first objection would be, oh, what about the cases of rape or incest? But they don't realize that's only 1% of the cases, and that we should focus on the general cases before trying to figure out what we should do in the particular minority cases. Okay, so the importance of the issue and the seriousness of the consequences. So you have to think about this. What if one side is right and the other side is wrong? If pro-choicers are right, then abortion is simply a medical intervention like any other, and pro-lifers only oppress women's rights, falsely accusing them of homicide. On the other hand, if the pro-lifers are right, then abortion is the deadliest invention in history, with around 42 million children being killed each year in the world. That is to say, between 100,000 to 150,000 homicides per day, and that's a huge number. This is why it's extremely important that both sides study the issue, because they cannot simply agree to disagree. We really need to find out who is right on this. And to find out who is right, we need to look at the facts, at science, and at moral philosophy. So this is what we'll be doing here. So here's a simple but strong pro-life argument that I use in my book. So it says, premise 1, it is wrong and it should be illegal to directly and voluntarily kill an innocent human being. Premise 2, the unborn are innocent human beings. Premise 3, abortion directly and voluntarily kills the unborn. 4, therefore, abortion is wrong and it should be illegal. So the conclusion follows logically and necessarily from the premises, meaning that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion is unavoidable. So we have to take a look at each premises in order to find out if they're true. So let's take a look at premise 1. Premise 1 states that it is wrong to directly and voluntarily kill innocent human beings. Okay, so this seems obvious to most people, right? It's directly grounded in human dignity or in human rights. All human beings should have the same basic rights, no matter their age, size, race, sex, level of development. And this could be considered as a basic axiom of moral reasoning. Also, it's important to note that the word innocent is really essential to the premise, because there are cases where it's permissible to kill someone who's threatening your life in self-defense or in war. Even people who defend death penalty could accept this premise, because people who defend death penalty say that it's permissible to kill human beings who have committed grave crimes, but not innocent human beings. So the word innocent is really important here, because it makes the premise acceptable by a wider range of people. And it's also very important to clarify that the act of killing must be intentional, because sometimes innocent people might be killed as collateral victims without the act being immoral in itself. Take the example of the terrorist planes that crashed in the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001. It seems plausible to say that it would have been morally acceptable to fire directly at the plane before it hit the towers in order to avoid a large number of casualties. However, blowing up the plane in midair would have had the unwanted secondary consequences of killing innocent human beings. Their death is not intentional, neither as an end or as a mean. Therefore, the notion of intentionality to kill is very important in our premise to avoid such counterexamples. But we will come back to this premise because, believe it or not, this is the only premise that is contested by pro-choice philosophers. Okay, so premise 2 states that the unborn are innocent human beings. So what is a human being, first of all? Human being is a well-defined term in biology. It simply means being a member of the species Homo sapiens. The fact that the unborn are human being is a basic biological fact that can be found in any textbook of embryology. Scientists are unanimous in saying that from the moment of fertilization and the formation of the zygotes, there's a distinct human organism independent of the mother. This organism is a member of the human species, biologically speaking, because it has human parents and human DNA. And here's an example from the human embryology and tetralogy textbooks that clearly states, although life is a continuous process, fertilization is a critical landmark because under ordinary circumstances, a new genetically distinct human organism is formed when the chromosomes of the male and the female pronuclei mix in the ovocytes. But how to prove to people in general that the unborn are human beings? Because you don't have always textbooks on your hand. So how do you prove this simply? Well, you can show three things. You can say that the unborn are human beings because they're alive, they're growing by cellular reproduction, they have human DNA, and they're a distinct growing organism. And so you have to make it clear that you're giving the scientific definition of what an organism is. So the scientific definition is a collection of biological parts or organs which work together to maintain a complete living being in existence. So those who say that a clump of cells is an organism are clearly mistaken. In biology, we use the term clump of cells when the parts do not interact for the good of the whole. So you can have the simple organism tests. This is given by Trenhorn. The test says, if I can give the thing in question enough time, food, and a suitable environment, and it is able to grow up and to be a mature member of its species, then it is indeed an organism and not a cluster of cells. So unlike the embryo, if you give food, time, and a good environment to cells in your body, which admittedly contain human DNA, you will never get a mature member of the human species. These skin cells are therefore not comparable to the embryos because they are not organisms. So this is the big difference. And yeah, you have to know what the definitions of embryos and fetuses are in biology. So simply an embryo is a developing human being from the conception to the stage where major organs are formed. So this is until the 8th week of pregnancy. And a human fetus, on the other hand, this comes from Latin and means a little child or small one. And it is a human being after the 8th week of pregnancy until birth. So from conception to the 8th week, you use the term embryo, and from the 8th week to birth, you use the term fetus. Now, some pro-choicers blame pro-lifers for saying that abortion kills babies or children. But the question we should ask them in response is, well, what is a baby? A very simple and scientifically rigorous definition of a baby is a small member of the human species. And since the embryos and fetuses, as we've shown, are small members of the human species, it follows that the term baby, you can use the term baby as soon as the zygote is formed following fertilization. That's totally adequate if you define baby like that. Okay, so yeah, just to note that pro-choicers also admit this biological fact. If you read the best pro-choicers like David Boonen or Peter Singer, they all admit that the unborn are human beings. If you read like David Boonen in his book, A Defense of Abortion, he writes, perhaps the simplest relationship between you and me on one hand and every human fetus since conception on the other hand is this. All are living members of the same Homo sapiens species. A fetus is simply a human being at a very early stage of development. And you have also a quote from Peter Singer. I'm not going to read everything, but you can read on the PowerPoint afterwards. saying it is possible to give a precise meaning to human being. We can use it as equivalent to member of the species Homo sapiens. Whether a being is a member of a particular species is something that can be determined scientifically by examining the nature of chromosomes in the cells of living organisms. In this sense, there is no doubt that from the moment of its first existence, an embryo conceived from human sperm and ova is a human being. So yeah, everyone agrees with this premise. It's not controversial. So I gave some slides on fetal development in the first trimester. I'm not going to read through all of them. It's just if you're interested in the detail of fetal development in the first trimester, you can read those 2 slides afterwards. Let's go to premise 3. So premise 3 states that abortion directly and voluntarily kills the unborn. Okay, so this is not controversial at all. This is literally what is meant by abortion. That is to say, the direct intentional killing of the human fetus or embryos. I already said that the definition of ending a pregnancy is wrong because C-section would be an abortion on this definition, and that if the baby survived, then we say that abortion has failed, and this demonstrates that the initial goal of abortion was to kill the unborn. And if you look at all the methods used for abortion in hospitals, like medical abortions using RU 486, suction, dilatation and evacuation, induction, dilatation and extractions, all these medical procedures intentionally kill the fetus. Even pro-choice philosopher Jeff McMahon agrees. The standard methods used to induce abortion clearly involve killing the fetus. The fetus dies either by being dismembered or by being poisoned. So even the pro-choicers admit this. Okay, so here's the intermediate conclusion. We have shown so far that the unborn are innocent human beings and that abortion directly and intentionally kills the unborn. Therefore, it follows logically that abortion directly and willfully kills an innocent human being. And pro-choicers who have a basic understanding of what abortion is and what embryology teaches us of the unborn will therefore have to deny premise 1 in order to avoid the conclusion that abortion is immoral. They must therefore argue that it is not always immoral to intentionally kill an innocent human being. But how exactly do they justify this? There have been 2 attempts in academia. First, some pro-choicers will say that they will establish disqualifying arguments by making a conceptual distinction between the terms human beings and persons. According to them, only persons have a right to life, not all human beings. Second, some try to maintain that even though the fetus is a person with the same right to life as you and I, abortion is still morally permissible because the fetus, although having a right to life, does not have the right to use his mother's body to be kept alive. This second category of arguments is called autonomous arguments or the right to refuse arguments. But before looking at the best pro-choice arguments, let us refute some common bad pro-choice arguments we hear daily, especially in non-academic circles. So what is common between these arguments, these bad pro-choice arguments, is that they don't address the real question: what are the unborn? They don't attempt to refute the pro-life position that all human beings have an equal right to life. So just take one example. Imagine the pro-choicer says, every child must be wanted by his parents. It would be unfair to give birth to a child who is not wanted. He may be unloved. Well, that doesn't address the question. If a mother doesn't want her 2-year-old, does she have the right to kill him? Well, of course not. But if the pro-life position is true and all human beings have the same right to life, then it follows that one should not kill the baby while it's in his mother's womb, even if he's not wanted. So this doesn't even address the question. Same thing for objection number 2. Restricting abortion would be unfair to the poor and the minorities who need it the most. Well, this doesn't work because you don't kill newborns or 2-year-olds who live in poor families to avoid them having a tough life. So this doesn't address the pro-life position. And same thing for statements like abortion is necessary to stop overpopulation. You can give the same response. Even if it were true that the world was overpopulated, you shouldn't kill 2-year-olds or people on the streets to stop overpopulation. If all of the members of the human species have the same right to life, then it follows abortion shouldn't be allowed either. Okay, and some people claim that even if abortion if abortion was made illegal, there would still be many abortions. This is true, but irrelevant, much the same way that if murder or theft were made illegal, there would still be murder or robbery. But the fact that a law can be broken does not mean we shouldn't oppose that law. For example, rape should not be legal, even though some people will continue to rape after it is made illegal. Okay, and this is the famous feminist arguments, no uterus, no opinion. So this is one of the worst pro-choice arguments. It's incredibly bad. If it were true, then Roe v. Wade should be overturned because the majority of the voters were male. So this just turns against the pro-choice position. But imagine now a guy like me giving an argument against abortion like the one I just gave. Do you really think the argument would magically become any better if it was repeated by a woman? Frankly, that would be sexist to discount my opinion just because I'm a male. Also, this argument implies that we do not have the right to speak out on an issue that doesn't concern us directly. However, this is clearly false. I can speak out against the rape of women, even though I don't have a uterus, and I will never be affected by it. Likewise, I can speak out against pedophilia, even though I'm not a child anymore, and I won't be affected by it. I can speak out against the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even though the bombing took place 50 years before I was born. I can say that slavery is immoral, even though I will never be a slave. Yeah, I mean, this just doesn't address the issue, because you can have opinion on things that don't concern you directly. Okay, okay, so here's another bad argument. You don't like abortions? Then don't have one. Stop telling others what to do. That's just as stupid as the last claim. We don't reject abortions for matters of taste or preference, but because abortion kills babies. Imagine someone defending slavery telling you, you don't like slavery? Well, don't buy a slave. Or imagine you were talking to a Nazi officer and you were trying to tell him, stop the Holocaust now. And the officer responded, you don't like the Holocaust? Well, don't kill Jews. I mean, you'd see how bad the argument is, right? So, okay. Okay, so now let's turn to a common pro-choice argument that's bad, but that's a bit more sophisticated than the other that I just gave. If abortion were made illegal, women will put their lives in danger by trying to have one on their own. Okay, so even if it were true, it wouldn't follow that abortion should be legal, because we don't make immoral actions legal so that it is safer for those who want to perform these immoral actions. A great example of this is the case of female genital mutilation. This practice still takes place in some countries in the Middle East, where young girls, including children, have their genitals surgically removed in order to satisfy the purity requirements of the local culture. This act leaves considerable physical and emotional scars on women and is condemned by almost all human rights associations. Now imagine someone were to argue the following. Some immigrants who arrive in my country continue to practice female genital mutilation. However, this practice is illegal in my country's hospital. The family members of these girls take them to be mutilated in back alleys by non-professional mutilators who risk injuring the little girls. Shouldn't we legalize female genital mutilation to make it safer? Well, most people will answer no, because it's a despicable act of violence that hurts young women. But then pro-lifers can respond, isn't abortion a despicable act of violence that harms small children? And so you see that the argument fails. Also, there's a good analogy given by Timothy Braham. He gives the following example. So imagine a woman wants to kill her strong 15-year-old child, but she fears that she might get hurt while trying to kill him because he's stronger than her. Should the state help her kill her child safely? The pro-choicer will answer, of course not, but it's completely different. We're talking about a 15-year-old child, not a fetus. But then this brings us back to the one and only question, what is the fetus? And do all human beings have the same value and dignity? if it turns out that the fetus has the same value as a 15-year-old, then the argument doesn't work. So this is recognized also as being a bad argument by pro-choice philosophers. Mary Ann Warren, one of the best defenders of the pro-choice position, says that the fact that restricting abortion has tragic side effects does not in itself show that restricting abortion is unjustified, since murder is wrong regardless of the circumstances that makes it prohibited. So a procedure cannot be said to be safe if half of the people who are involved end up dying. So the fundamental question we can ask the pro-choice person is, should we make it legal to kill an innocent person so that it is safer for the killer? Or should we help strong people kill weak and innocent people so that it is easier and safer for the stronger people? Since the answer is no, the argument collapses. Okay, and now here's the last one of the last ones. No, there are more after that. I'm personally against abortion, but I do not want to impose my beliefs on others. So this is commonly heard in our societies, because of moral relativism. A good way to respond is by taking examples like, I'm personally against rape, but I don't want to impose my view on rapists. Or I'm personally against murder, but I don't want to force my beliefs on murderers. So people will understand that this line of argument is just bad, because if abortion kills babies, then it's not a matter of preference. It's good to convince others to stop doing harmful actions to others. Okay, so here's another argument. The anti-abortion position is a religious belief that should not be imposed in a secular state. Okay, so this is clearly false. It's true that being religious often implies being against abortion, but the opposite is not true. So for example, I'm a Catholic, so my Catholic beliefs imply that I'm against slavery or raping women. But you don't have to be a Catholic to believe that slavery or raping women is wrong, right? This can be, you can know this through human reason alone. You don't have to be a Catholic to be against all those issues. There are, in fact, hardcore atheists like Christopher Hitchens who are pro-life for purely human rights and secular reasons. And there are plenty of non-religious groups like Secular Pro-Life on internet that give rational, non-religious arguments against abortion. And Bernard Nathanson, who's an ex-abortionist and atheist, here's a quote from him. In the case of abortion, we have to decide whether or not it should be banned based on biological data and humanistic fundamentals, without appealing to the Bible, creeds, or hierarchical decrees, or even God. Even if God does not exist, the fetus does exist. Okay, so here's another argument. My body, my choice. Everyone has the right to do whatever they want with their body. Okay, so this premise is clearly false. No one has the absolute right to do whatever he or she wants with his or her body. For example, we're not free to use our bodies to rape women, rob banks, commit murders, torture children, go walk naked on the streets, etc. We don't have the right to use our bodies to hurt or kill other people. If it turns out that a fetus is a human being with a right to life, then bodily autonomy does not justify killing this innocent human being. So here's an objection. One might say that, okay, you don't have the right to do everything you want with your body, but you can have the right to do anything you want inside your body. And since pregnancy takes place inside the woman, then it follows that abortion should be permissible. But this is not clear, because if it were the case that you could do anything you want inside your body, then this would imply you could legalize all of the dangerous drugs as well as prostitution. This, maybe one can argue for this, but it's not clear and it's controversial. But there are even better counterexamples to show that this position is false. For example, intentionally causing birth defects. So there's a drug called thalidomide. It's a medicine that was used to prevent nausea during pregnancy, but that also has side effects of causing children to be born without arms or legs. And so if the sovereign zone argument is correct, then women should have the right to take such a drug, even if it causes disabilities in unborn children. And of course, even pro-choicers would recognize that you can't take a drug that causes babies to be born without arms or legs. That's deeply immoral. And so it refutes the claim that you can do everything you want inside your body. And even pro-choicers recognize that women shouldn't drink or smoke while they're pregnant. So this is not actually too controversial. Back to the better pro-choice arguments. So now that we've covered the bad pro-choice arguments, because they don't address the central issue, we can take a look at the better ways pro-choice philosophers have defended abortion in academia. So there are two options to deny the premise it is immoral to directly and intentionally kill an innocent human being. First, as I said, you can claim that even though the unborn are human beings, they are not persons, and only persons have a right to life. So this position is taken by philosophers like Warren, Minerva, Singer, etc. The other line of argument that is found in academia is to claim that even if the unborn are persons with the right to life, from this right to life, it doesn't follow that they have the right to be kept alive using someone else's body. And these are the autonomous type arguments defended by Thompson, Boonin, etc. Okay, so how to address disqualifiers? First, we can start by saying that they have the burden of proofs. I mean, all things being equal, we should start with the presumption that all human beings have a right to life. Unless there's a good reason to doubt this, the simplest theory, that is to say, all human beings deserve basic rights, is the better because of Occam's razor. The simplicity is a theoretical virtue. The pro-choicer will then have to find specific characteristics that makes the fetus less valuable than a born child and not a literal person. So the questions we can ask pro-choicers are then, what is a person? What are the characteristics that make us a person? When does personhood begin? That's a really important question. And no one can claim to defend abortion unless they have good answers to all of these questions. Okay, so how to determine these criteria? First, we have to note that since all humans differ in size, intelligence, gender, skin color, physical abilities, etc., we should ground our human equality not in our capacities, but in the one thing we have in common, our human nature. Indeed, if the right to life of human beings were based on properties which come in degrees, such as the level of intelligence or size, then the right to life too would come in degrees. But this is problematic. It would mean that smarter people have more rights than the less intelligent people, or that taller people would have more would be more valuable than smaller people. So therefore, it would make much more sense to associate our right to life in a property that cannot be acquired in degrees. That is to say, a binary property. So a definition of personhood that seems to be appropriate would be Boethius' definition. So the definition given by Boethius is individual substance with a rational nature. This is good because it grounds it grounds personhood in a binary property that is rationality. It's not a property that comes in degrees, and so it's binary. Either you have it or you don't. And it just means that your cognitive faculties have to be naturally ordered towards reason. This doesn't mean you have to exercise it at all times. One thing to note is that this definition given by Boethius is not human-centered. Persons could include non-human creatures if they exist. So, for example, angels or aliens, if they exist, would be persons. By rational nature, we mean that the person in question must have his cognitive faculties naturally ordered towards reason. And as we said, we are not saying that the being in question must use his reason at the present moment. Otherwise, people in coma or the mentally handicapped would not be persons. Likewise, if the fetus is not able to use its cognitive faculties, even if the fetus is not able to use his cognitive faculties at the present moment, it is naturally ordered towards developing those faculties, ontologically speaking. This is not the case for a dog fetus, for example, that is not ordered towards the capacity to develop abstract reasoning or rationality. Okay, so this definition of personhood on the pro-life camp is completely consistent metaphysically. So the pro-choicers will be forced to come up with another definition of personhood if they want to maintain their positions. If the pro-choicers tells you, I don't know what a person is, but I know the fetus is not a person, they're taking a contradictory position. Because you cannot say a triangle is not a square if you don't know the definition of a square. You can respond to them with a bit of humor. I don't know what a person is, but I know that Black humans are not people. And then the pro-choicers will understand that this position is inconsistent. Because you cannot claim that, you cannot say that an object X does not belong to category Y if you do not know the criteria for belonging to category Y. This just doesn't make sense. So they have to offer a definition of personhood too. And show, not only offer one definition, but to show why their definition would be better than the Boecian definition I just gave. So how to disqualify the unborn? So in proposing a discriminatory criterion for granting the right to life to some human beings and not other, the pro-choicers must give a criteria that is binary, because the right to life does not come in degrees, and make sure this criteria is morally relevant to discriminate a whole category of human beings with a right to life. Unless and until he does that, the pro-life position will win by default. And so philosopher Stephen Schwartz has shown that there are in principle 4 differences between the born and the unborn. These differences can be summed up in the acronym SLED. So by SLED, we mean size, level of development, environments, and degree of dependencies. But do these differences really matter for acquiring the right to life? This is what we will see next. So we'll start with size. Okay, so size is not a good criteria for determining the value of human life. A newborn baby is much closer in size to a fetus than a fetus is to an adult. It is recognized that the newborn baby is no less valuable or worthy, even though he is smaller than an adult. If size was a good criteria for determining the value of human life, then the life of a basketball player would be worth more than a life of a toddler, which is absurd, of course. And imagine there was a shrinking machine that could shrink you to the size of 4 inches tall. Do you think you would really lose your human dignity if such a machine were to exist? Of course not. This shrinking would have absolutely no influence of your intrinsic worth or on your dignity. Size cannot therefore be a relevant criterion for discriminating human beings and denying them the status of personhood, of being a person. Okay, so the second criteria that people can propose is the level of development. But as we noted, this criteria cannot be good because it's not a binary one, but it's a continuous one, right? You don't develop in the blink of an eye, you develop in a continuous process. But the right to life is not continuous. It makes no sense to say, okay, I have 40% right to life, then a 50% right to life, then a 60% right to life. I mean, either you have a right to life or you don't. So again, if the criteria is not binary, this is not going to work. And so people try to offer binary criteria like consciousness or self-awareness, but philosophers who propose these criteria also defend infanticide, because the newborns are not yet self-aware or conscious. So some people take that to the logical consequences and really defend infanticide. That's like Peter Singer. But many people are not going to be prepared to deny the status of personhood to a newborn baby. And some people say that sentience, you become a person when you're first sentient, but that doesn't make sense, because being sentient or being able to feel pain is irrelevant to personhood. There are many non-human animals that are sentient or that are able to feel pain, like rats and pigeons, but they're not persons. So a fetus, as we said, is much closer in its level of development to a newborn baby than a newborn is to an adult. And this gives us a reason to really doubt the objection of the level of development. Okay, now let's turn to the environment criteria. So some pro-choicers say that the fetus is not a person since it's not in the world yet. But why does living in a particular environment make someone a person? If moving from one place to another outside of the womb has absolutely no bearing on whether we are persons or not, then why would going out of the womb suddenly give the title of person to the fetus? It would be weird to say that 1 minute before childbirth, the human being in utero did not have the status of a person, but 1 minute after birth, he instantly became one. Generally speaking, the place where we live has absolutely no influence on your value. And Peter Singer recognizes this. He writes, quote, the pro-lifers are right about one thing. The location of the baby in the uterus or outside the womb cannot be a crucial moral difference. We cannot consistently say that it is morally okay to kill a fetus a week before birth, but as soon as the baby is born, everything must be done to keep it alive. All of this shows us that the location of the child in its mother womb has nothing to do with his intrinsic worth. Finally, the degree of dependency. So to discriminate a group of human beings simply because they are dependent on other people is absolutely disturbing and abhorrent. It is not permissible to kill human beings just because they are dependent, because we are all dependent in some sense. Newborns too remain dependent after birth when they leave their mother's body. They would be dead in a few hours if left alone on the hospital table. In fact, many newborns are even dependent on their mother's body after birth for breastfeed. A 2-year-old child is also very dependent on his parents. They need to feed him, change his diapers, dress him, put him to bed, etc. We are all dependent in some sense. If being dependent on others gave us permission to kill, then why not kill the disabled who are much more dependent than a baby? And they are sometimes a heavier burden than carrying a baby. People who are very dependent, like the disabled in wheelchairs, are no less valuable than you or me. We are all equal in dignity regardless of our degree of dependency, and it is therefore absurd to use this criterion to disqualify human beings who are still in utero. So the conclusion is that none of these differences matter. All the criteria we have just listed are arbitrary. They do not touch upon the nature of the being in question, but rather on his or her capacities. We have proposed a very consistent definition of personhood, individual substance with a rational nature. These definitions include all human beings without discriminating against any, since it affects the nature of the being in questions and not their capacities at time t. It is very inclusive and guarantees the equality of all human beings. You don't have to be very strong, tall, or intelligent, highly developed, etc., to be a person with your own dignity and be part of the human family. Merely being human is enough. So now let's turn to the agnostic argument against abortion. So imagine you haven't been quite convinced that the unborn are persons. Imagine you still have some doubts about the question and that the arguments I just presented didn't fully convince you. Then this agnostic arguments will show you why you should be against abortion. So suppose you are going hunting in the woods with a friend and everyone goes their own way. An hour later, you hear a noise in the bush 20 meters away from you, and you don't know if it's your friend or if it's an animal. Do you shoot? Of course not. It would be moral negligence because you take the risk of killing a human person. If there's only a 5% chance that your friend is hiding in the bush, you don't shoot until you are sure. This safety principle is applied every day in our society. A building demolisher would never say, I'm pretty sure that the building I'm about to demolish has no one inside. There's a 95% chance that this demolition will be done without victims. Let's go, let's blow it up. This would be criminal negligence if such a such a guy did that. So the agnostic arguments just shows there are 4 possibilities. Either the fetus is a person and we know it, either the fetus is a person and we do not know it, either the fetus is not a person and we do not know it, or the fetus is not a person and we know it. So what is abortion in each case? In case number 1, it is clear that abortion is murder. You know that the fetus is a person and you deliberately choose to kill him. So that's clearly murder. In case number 2, abortion is manslaughter and is gravely culpable since there has been negligence on your part. This goes back to the analogy I just gave with the guy hunting in the woods. In case number 3, abortion is moral negligence since you took the risk of killing an innocent person. You're lucky in this case, no one died, but you should be punished for criminal negligence. Finally, only option 4 is morally acceptable, but the pro-choicer has to claim to know to a certain degree of certainty that the unborn are not persons. So what this argument reveals is that as long as you don't have the moral certainty that the fetus is not a human person, then abortion is always immoral. In reality, the pro-choice person must argue that he absolutely knows that the fetus is not a person. He must have moral certainty before taking action. But how exactly could he have such certainty? The burden of proof on his part is huge. And as Anne Litze says, quote, the very fact that the moral status of the embryo is controversial must be taken into account in our moral considerations. Specifically, this raises the question about the approval of a practice that kills a being whose status is controversial. So the safety principle applies. If you don't know, don't kill. Okay, so now let's turn to violinists, the bodily autonomous type arguments. So this is the violinist analogy, which has been made well known since Judith Jarvis Thomson wrote her essay, A Defense of Abortion, in 1971 on the subject. So basically the analogy goes like this. You wake up one morning in a hospital, plugged into a famous violinist. You've been kidnapped during the night by the Society of Music Lovers, and the doctor tells you in the morning you wake up, oh, we're sorry, but you're the only person in the world who can help this violinist by donating your kidney or some kind of blood transfusion. If you stay plugged in to him during 9 months, then everything will be fine. The violinist will be healed, and you can leave after that. Everything will be fine. And so the argument goes like this. It says that it would be really nice of you if you decided to give your kidney or blood as a form of life support, but you don't have the moral obligation to do it. You don't have the moral obligation to stay plugged in for 9 months. So much the same way as the state shouldn't force you to keep someone alive using your body, the state shouldn't force you to keep someone alive in the womb. And hence the argument goes as follows. Premise 1, it is morally permissible to disconnect from the violinist. Premise 2, however, the act of abortion is morally comparable to the act of disconnecting from the violinist. 3, conclusion, therefore, it is morally permissible to have an abortion. So in general, no one denies premise 1, except for Peter Singer, who is a utilitarian philosopher. He actually believes you have the moral obligation to stay plugged in into the violinist because of his utilitarian philosophy, but almost everyone agrees that this is just wrong. And so to attack the violinist arguments, you need to refute premise 2 and show how the act of abortion is completely disanalogous to the act of disconnecting from the violinist.
Let me add really quick too that even, David Otterberg in his book, Applied Ethics, thinks you should remain attached to the violinist. So it's Peter Singer, and also we have a Thomist who believes that, but that is a minority position.
Does he say that the state should force you to stay plugged in, or that it would be morally because there's a difference between a moral obligation and a legal obligation?
I'm not sure if he would make it. I'm not sure if, well, one is that he only is considering applied ethics cases and not public policy. But I wouldn't see it being a far stretch for him to say, well, it should be legally enforced. But he thinks it's a moral obligation you remain attached.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So I actually think that for stranger, maybe not. For your own children, that's a good question. If it's your own child that needs your bodily support, for example, your 2-year-old, maybe you do have such moral obligation. I'm not sure. I'm agnostic on this position. So anyways, let's go to the problems with the arguments. So first I'll start with some initial thoughts. And then I'll give you 5 objections. So the responsibility objection, the direct killing versus letting die objection, intentional death versus non-intentional death, parental obligations objection, and finally the organ use objection using intrinsic teleology. So as for my initial thoughts, in Thompson's analogy, the burden of pregnancy is exaggerated. The person connected to the violinist is not to go out or leave the room to have a job to socialize. She is bedridden, waiting for 9 months. This is absolutely not the case in most pregnancies, which still leave a great deal of freedom to the woman. Thompson compares carrying a child to a horrible, degrading, enslaving situation. On the contrary, science shows that very few women are bedridden during their pregnancies and that they can do many activities outside the hospital room. Thompson therefore overestimates the burdens of gestation. As Rosalind Hursthouse puts it, quote, in the case of the violinist aide, I can't do my job. I can't do my job. I can't go visit my unhealthy mother. I can't go to my sister's wedding. I can't go to the cinema or to the restaurant or have a confidential conversation with someone. I cannot have sex, and all of this for 9 months. Therefore, pregnancy does not impose such a burden in the vast majority of cases. So here's the first disanalogy. Further, in defending this argument, Thompson asserts that pregnancy is the only instance in which society demands that a member must undergo a large-scale sacrifice for the good of others. But this is simply wrong, as Alexander Proust pointed out. He gives the example of being drafted by the states to go to war and saying that this is a much heavier burden than pregnancies, because we sometimes require soldiers to use their bodies for the defense of the common good, and they can risk their own lives. So this is way more burdensome than pregnancies. Thompson is just wrong on this. Okay, so first objection, the responsibility objection. So first we should start to note that over 99% of pregnancies are the product of voluntary sex. In the case of the violinist, I have no obligation to stay connected to him because I have absolutely no responsibility for him becoming ill. On the contrary, in 99% of cases, the woman is partly responsible for being pregnant because she freely engaged in an act ordered towards creating a helpless person. She has caused someone to be dependent on her own body. Therefore, she has the moral obligation to assist the innocent child she has herself created, as well as the father, who has the moral obligation to provide child support after birth. In the violinist case, you're not responsible for his condition. You didn't cause him to be dependent on you, and therefore you don't have the same moral obligations. This is why even pro-choice philosophers like Michael Tooley recognize that the Thompson's analogies fail. He says, quote, the anti-abortion person can argue very well that in general, people do not have a moral obligation to let a fetus use their bodies, even when it is necessary for the survival of another individual. But a pregnant woman in general has a moral obligation to let the fetus use her body because she is morally responsible for the fact the fetus needs her uterus. So this is even rejected by some of the most famous pro-choice philosophers. All right, let's go to David Boonen's objection. So David Boonen objects by responding that you're not always responsible for the consequences of your actions. So he gives the thought experiment. Imagine you go you choose to go walk to a park, knowing that there's a low probability that your purse will be stolen. Can it really be said the fact you consented to go to the park imply that you also have consented to your purse being stolen? Well, of course not. The fact that you knew in advance that this could happen doesn't imply you consented to that action. So what Boonen means by that is that you can consent to the sexual act, but not consent to being pregnant. But this is a horrible objection. And the problem with this analogy given by Boonen is that the sexual act is naturally ordered towards procreation, while the act of going to the park is not naturally ordered towards having one's wallet stolen. In addition, there are many situations where we did not consent to the consequences of an act, but we are still responsible for these consequences. For example, if I drive drunk and I have a car accident, I'm responsible for the car accidents, even though I did not directly consent to it. I can't get out of the car and say, oh, I'm sorry, I hit you, I broke your ribs, but I only consented to drive, not to run over you. Likewise, I can't play baseball and break my neighbor's window with a baseball bat, with a baseball ball, and go to him and say, sorry, I only consented to play baseball. I didn't consent to break your window. No, it's obvious that there's a moral obligation to take responsibility for the consequences of one's actions, even if they were not intended as such. From the moment the parents engage in an act naturally ordered towards the creation of a human being, they have the moral obligation not to kill their child. So another way to refute the argument is to propose a better analogy than Thomson. So here's a modified version of the violinist case that takes into account the notion of responsibility. Okay, so imagine the Society of Music Lovers organizes a party with 10,000 guests, and that in order to join the party, you must agree to participate in a draw where someone is chosen by chance to be plugged to the violinist. Knowing that there's 1 in a 10,000 chance you will be designated for 9 months to be plugged into the violinist, you still decide to participate in the party because you consider that the risk is small and you want to enjoy the free pleasures of the party, which are here analogous to the pleasure of the sexual act. So you register, and unlucky as you may be, you're the one designated to be hooked up after the party is finished. So here it is clear that you no longer have the right to refuse to be connected to the violinist because you freely engaged in an action, that is to say, going to the party, which had the potential consequence of you being designated to use your body to help another person in need. This is much more similar to pregnancy. When someone freely engages in an act that has the potential to create an innocent and needy human person, there's a moral duty to care for him or her. So Thomson's violinist argument just collapses, at least in the cases of consensual intercourse. Okay, second objection, the direct killing versus letting die objection. So there's a big moral difference in moral philosophy between directly killing a healthy person, in the case of abortion, and letting a person in poor health die by refusing to intervene. This is the case of the violinist. In fact, by disconnecting, you choose to separate yourself from the violinist without attacking his physical integrity. You cut the cord that connects you to him, but you don't attack his body. Abortion, on the contrary, directly kills the baby through a willful and deliberate act. It is not comparable to disconnection, apart from the extremely rare cases of hysterectomy and cases of ectopic pregnancies, but these are not really abortions. Imagine that instead of disconnecting from the violinist, you had to brutally attack him by ripping off his limbs one by one, by inserting a syringe to aspirate his brains, and finally crush his skull. You would say that it's not just comparable to unplugging, it would be direct murder if you did that. Yet this procedure is exactly what happens in all second and third trimester abortions. Even the abortions methods used in the first trimester directly destroy the fetus. So if such violent means were used, the violinist's death would no longer be the result of his own pathology, but it would be your own fault. And this makes a big moral difference. Third objection, intentional death versus non-intentional death objection. In the violinist analogy, his death is anticipated but unwanted. You don't want the violinist to die. You would be happy if he'd survive. Disconnecting from the violinist suggests that the violinist's death was a result of his illness, not of your will. He would die anyway if you refuse to help him. So when you disconnect from him, it is more analogous to the medical staff choosing not to intervene by extraordinary means to save him. You are not causing his death intentionally. In the case of abortion, things are very different because you intentionally cause someone's death. If the baby survives, the abortion failed. If the violinist were to survive, this would be a blessing. Fourth, the parental obligations objection. So for this analogy is the fact that parents have special duties towards their own children, that strangers do not have between them. The mother-child dependency relationship, in particular, is radically different from the relationship between two strangers. Parents have moral obligations to their children that strangers do not have, and they often have to use their bodies to help their children. Indeed, for example, the father must use his body to work and meet the needs of the family. Likewise, a mother should use her breast to feed her infants, assuming there's no formula around. So even after birth, a mother is expected to use her body to take care of the basic needs of her children. Suppose the mother finds herself locked up alone in a prison in Afghanistan with no powdered milk around. It is clear that she has the moral obligation to use her body, in this case her breast, to feed her baby. If a parent does not use their body to provide for their child's most basic needs, then there's parental neglect. Yeah, and this would be even considered homicide if you let your child starve to death by refusing to breastfeed them when there's no formula available. This would be just parental neglect. And such parental obligations are not present in the case of the violinist because the guy is a complete stranger. Finally, the last objection is the organ use objection. This is founded upon intrinsic teleology. So we can start by agreeing with Thompson that organ donation should remain optional. However, we deny that pregnancy is analogous to organ donation. Clearly, our organs have their own purpose. Even from a non-religious perspective, this is obvious. My heart is for pumping my blood. My lungs are for breathing air in my body. My eyes are for seeing. In short, each of my organs has its own purpose to save the proper functioning of my body. This is why organ donation should always be optional. No one has to force you to donate your blood or kidneys to save the violinist, because you shouldn't force people to make extraordinary use of their organs. However, there's one exception: the uterus. When someone asks the question, what is the uterus for? The obvious answer is to say, well, the uterus is the organ that keeps a baby alive before it is born. This is only function. The uterus is the only organ, with perhaps the exception of the woman's breast, that is specifically designed for another person in its natural function. But if the uterus is naturally ordered towards providing the vital needs for the baby, does the child not have the right to this organ which is designed for him? Unlike the cases of the violinist, I have the right to refuse to intervene to save someone dying, but abortion separates the child from an organ whose sole purpose is to provide for his basic needs. And that's a big morally relevant difference. So in sum, it seems quite strange to assert that the fetus has a right to life, but that it does not have the right to make use of the only organ which is naturally ordered to keep him alive without his mother's permission. That would be like saying women have the right to vote, but they are not allowed to enter a voting booth without the permission of the organizers. Either way, it's not a real right, it's a right in name only. So this is why I believe the violinist arguments fails miserably. Right, so now I can go to the tough cases for the pro-life position. There are four I'm going to talk about: rape, handicapped baby, the viability, what if the child is not viable, and the threats to the mother's life. So for the cases of rape, we must remind everyone that rape cases are really rare. Yeah, you should ask the person if they would be in favor of banning abortion in all cases other than rape. Usually the response of the pro-choicer is to say no, and then the debate is recentered towards the main issue. But if the person is really against abortion in all cases except rape, you can present two thought experiments to show how inconsistent this is. So the first thought experiment, it comes from me. It's I invented this one. It's called the Taliban thought experiments. So suppose a woman was kidnapped by the Taliban who decided to rape her. She is put into prison as a hostage. Suppose she gets pregnant in prison, but after 9 months, the terrorists decide they no longer need her to negotiate, and they decide to release her. The woman gives birth soon after in the woods. Does she have the right to kill this child? No, of course not. Ultimately, she can give the child for adoption, but she has no right to get rid of the child by killing it directly and willfully after it is born. So if the pro-life position is right, meaning that the newborn's life is worth the same value as a fetus or as an embryo, then it follows that you shouldn't abort in rape cases also. And the other thought experiment comes from Trent Horn in his book Persuasive Pro-Life. And so Trent says, okay, imagine a woman having sex with her husband on a daily basis, and one day this same woman who's married gets raped by a stranger. And a few weeks later, the woman finds out she's pregnant, but she does not know if the baby comes from the stranger or from her husband. She does not know who is the father. So the couple decides to go for a DNA test to find the real identity of the fathers, and the doctors assure that the father of the child is indeed the husband. So the woman decides to keep the child, and she gives birth to the child a few months later. But 3 months after birth, the doctors call back to say, oops, sorry, we made a mistake in the DNA test, and actually the father is the rapist. We're really sorry, we got the test wrong. And so the woman is devastated, of course, because she holds in her arms the product of a rape. But the question is, does she now have the right to kill her baby while it's in the crib, having learned that it was the result of rape? The answer is no. It would be wrong to kill this innocent human being for the crime of his father. Your intrinsic value does not depend on how you were conceived, but on what type of being you are. If the fetus is not a person, then there's no need to bring up these difficult cases to legalize abortion. But if the fetus is a person who has the same rights as a newborn baby, then the fact that he was conceived by rape should not justify killing him. Okay, let's go to the handicapped baby objection. So people say sometimes, well, you can have an abortion if your baby is handicapped. But this is very easy to refute. You can just ask the person if they would be prepared to kill a 5-year-old because he has Down syndrome or a severe handicap. If the answer is yes, then the person is barbaric. There's no need for further discussion with that person. But if the answer is no, and it's generally the case, people don't think you should kill 5-year-olds who have Down syndrome, then you shouldn't kill babies with the same disabilities when they are in their mother's womb, if their life is worth the same than a newborn baby. So on the pro-life perspective, this doesn't make sense to argue like this. Okay, what if the child is not viable? Well, to answer this objection, we could ask the person, would it be okay to kill my 10-year-old son knowing that he has a serious incurable disease and that he will eventually die in a few weeks? The answer is obviously no. Like, just the fact that I know my son is going to die in a few weeks doesn't give me the right to kill him before he dies. And so if all human beings are equal in value and moral worth, you shouldn't kill non-viable child, just like you wouldn't kill an adult who is about to die in a few weeks, for example. So this is not a strong objection. So now let's go to the hardest of the hardest cases, and it's when the mother's life is in danger. So in today, with today's medical technology, when you have a second or third trimester pregnancies, what you do is you attempt a C-section to save both the mother and the baby. And even if it's early in the second trimester and there's a small chance that the baby will survive, like a 1% chance, you still do it because you did everything you could to save both. So there's nothing morally problematic in having a C-section here, as long as the intention is to save them both. When it's not possible to save the mother and the baby, it is morally legitimate to perform an act to save the mother, even though you foresee that the baby will die in the process, as long as the death is unintentional, using the principle of double effect. There are two cases of this today. So ectopic pregnancies and hysterectomy. Ectopic pregnancies is when the the embryo it does not implant in the uterus, but sometimes in the fallopian tubes. And so you have to save the mother, you have to cut the fallopian tube, and the embryo dies as a secondary unwilled consequence of this. So you didn't have the intention to kill the embryo. Therefore, this is not an abortion. It's not morally problematic. Same thing for hysterectomy. Hysterectomy just means to remove the uterus. And so some women who have a cancerous uterus need to have their uterus removed. And if they're pregnant when they have their uterus removed, then the uterus is removed with the embryo inside. It will eventually die, but there was no direct intentional killing on its parts. And so therefore it's not an abortion, it's not immoral. And so today, abortions are no longer necessary to save a mother's life. Mary Ann Warren admits this. She says, quote, "Given the relative safety of the new artificial induction techniques during the third trimester, the danger to a woman's life or health is no longer an argument to make abortion legal." So this is even recognized by pro-choicers. However, the hardest case of the hard cases is craniectomy. So craniectomy does not take place today, because today we can just have a C-section. Craniectomy, for those who don't know, is when the baby's skull was too large to go through the uterus, and the doctors had to crush the skull in order to make it go through and to save the mother. This was practiced before the 20th century, and because we didn't have the technology yet to do good C-sections. And so this is not a case that arises today, but there has been a disagreement amongst pro-life philosophers whether this was permissible or not, whether craniectomy used to be permissible in the past. And I think craniectomy was permissible, but I'm not going to argue this using double effect. I think it's permissible as a case of self-defense, and yeah, because self-defense has been recognized as a case where you can directly kill a human being, and so here some might object that the child is innocent, and so you can't use self-defense against innocent people. But that's actually not true. The problem with this objection is that self-defense applies even when the person who threatens our physical integrity is unaware of what they're doing. So for example, if a drunk man is about to stick a knife in your stomach, you're allowed to kill him in self-defense, even though he is not conscious of his actions. He threatens your physical integrity, which gives you a right to self-defense. The cases of pregnancies where the fetus is endangering the mother can be analyzed in the same way. Obviously, the fetus is totally unconscious and is not trying to kill the mother on purpose. However, he can be considered as a material aggressor. That is to say, not a guilty aggressor, not morally culpable, but he's still a material aggressor, and self-defense is permissible against material aggressors too.
Let me
so
add,
this
Matthew.
position was, yeah.
Sorry, Matthew. Let me also add, just I think maybe, so I think that the analogy could be strengthened if you just had someone who was maybe sleepwalking or something like that, right? Because, I think that if you get yourself drunk, you're culpable for that and what follows, right? But
Sure.
obviously, like if you're sleepwalking, you can't help it. Yeah.
Yeah, in the book, I give the example of someone who injected a poisonous liquid that makes you crazy and makes you lose your mind. And the guy tries to threaten your life, being totally unconscious of what he's doing. And it was not his fault that he drank alcohol, but someone else injected this sort of liquid in him. So this example works better than the drunk. You're right, the drunk example. So this is how I would defend craniectomy, but this doesn't happen anymore today, so it's unimportant. It's just interesting like that, but it's not relevant to today.
I also wanted to bring up what is it? Christopher. I had Christopher Kaiser on my show before, and are you aware of like how he deals with this particular problem?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, for the audience's sake, he just basically says that if you're trying to reduce the size of the child's head, you're not intending that they die, right? So it's, for instance, if you're able to reduce the size of the head such that the child would still survive, that would be good. You wouldn't, like, after the child's out, just smush the head, right? So he considers this also a case of unintentional killing, which is still technically, I guess, but it's still a case of direct killing, I guess, because that is the direct object of what you're doing. But it's not intended. But you think that response doesn't work, or?
No, I think it's a bit over the top, because when you try to, when you crush someone's head and you say, well, I didn't, oops, I didn't intend him to die. That seems over the top. I think intellectually the stronger defense is the self-defense objection, because this works. This just works. I mean, it works for a material aggressor, and clearly a child who's threatening his mother's life is a material aggressor. It's way easier to answer it like that.
All right.
Yeah, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay, so here are hard cases for pro-choicers, because we're not the only ones who have hard cases. First hard case, abortion done for frivolous reasons. So Naomi Wolf, who is a pro-choice feminist, admits that in her childhood, she has witnessed a lot of frivolous abortions around her. So she says, quote, "Of the abortions I have experienced, here are some of the reasons that have been given. To make sure you can get pregnant, forcing a boy to take a relationship more seriously, perform a rite of passage from childhood to teenage years for girls. In my school, the abortion drama was used to test her boyfriend's character to see if he would walk the girl to the operating table." So this is really, yeah, it's a bit shocking. And even most pro-choicers recognize that these actions are immoral, and but they have no morally adequate reason to answer why this is immoral exactly. Because if it turns out that the fetus or embryo has no worth or dignity, then what these girls did has absolutely is not immoral at all. Right? And another case that's shocking is Aliza Schwartz, who in 2008 got pregnant on purpose several times, so she could have an abortion afterwards and take the fetal remains for her project, for her art project at school. And she was from Yale University. And this shocked even pro-choicers at her school. I think she did that like, yeah, 5 times. This is just horrible. And yet the pro-choicers,
Matthieu, I'm sorry, I need to say that is horrifying, like disgusting.
That is horrifying. Yeah. But the pro-choicers cannot say why this was horrifying. And on the debate group, I asked pro-choicers what they thought of this case, if it should be legal to do things like that. And they said, well, I would probably not do that, but I mean, I think abortion should be legal for any reason whatsoever. And so, yeah, that should be legal. So, I mean, it's hard to argue with guys like that. But if you're a pro-choice person and you think that what this girl did was immoral, how exactly are you going to argue that this was immoral, right? On your view, the fetus has no moral value or dignity. Another hard case for pro-choicers is sex-selective abortions. What would feminists think if a woman wanted to abort her baby just because she was a girl? In most countries, the majority of abortions performed on the basis of sex selection affect little girls. Some American polls report that 85% of women and 95% of men would rather have their first child be a male. If abortion is not more serious than removing a clump of cells, then such a practice should not be prohibited. Ultimately, one could object that the parents have a sexist ideology, but they could not deny them the right to abortion, since the fetus does not have a particular moral status. Third, the legal consequences of the murder of a pregnant woman. So the murder of a pregnant woman intuitively seems more serious than the murder of a non-pregnant woman. Even supporters of the death penalty would never dare to put a pregnant woman to death. They would at least wait until the baby is born. From a consistent pro-choice stance, the murder of a pregnant woman is not more serious than a regular murder, since the fetus does not have a right to life. But in this case, a good question to ask the pro-choicers is to ask them, in the case of the murder of a pregnant woman, should the criminal's punishments be changed depending on whether the child was wanted or not. And that's a question which they have sometimes difficulties to answer, because on their view, the punishment should be the same. But there are many laws, even in the US, that recognize this as double homicide. Even in pro-choice states. I mean, even states that recognize the legality of abortion, they sometimes condemn the murder of pregnant women by double homicide, and that's internally inconsistent. And finally, another hard case is the inconsistency of wanting to make abortion rarer. Some supporters of abortion law want to make it safe, rare, and legal. But why rare exactly? Why say things like, we all agree that the number of abortions should be reduced? This statement does not make any sense. If abortion is not immoral, why would you want to make it rarer? If the human fetus has no intrinsic value, there is no reason to make abortion rare. Christopher Kaiser has calculated that a woman could technically get up to 100 abortions in her lifetime, throughout all her fertile years. He compares this to a girl who has used contraception all her life and has never had an abortion. And he asks the following question: would these two behaviors be morally equivalent? If there's nothing immoral about aborting, then the logical, consistent answer would be yes. Of course, we know that there's a major moral difference between using contraception all your life and having 100 abortions. But only the pro-life position can explain this. So a good question to ask the pro-choice person would be, is there a limit on the number of abortions a woman can legally have in her life? If so, what is that limit? Why would you want to impose a limit if the fetus does not have a special moral status? So in conclusion, the only question that should matter in the abortion debate is, what are the unborn? Craig Kukel writes, if the fetus is not a human being, then no justification is needed to legalize abortion. On the other hand, if the fetus is a human being, no justification for abortion is adequate. The pro-life position, as we said, is simple and inclusive. It is founded upon human rights. All human beings are equal in value and dignity and should have a basic right to life. You don't need to be religious to recognize that it is wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. And here are a few book recommendations that I suggest to people. So Christopher Kaiser's The Ethics of Abortion, which is recognized even by David Boonen as being one of the best pro-life defenses. Another book that I recommend is Pro-Life Answers to Pro-Choice Arguments by Randy Alcorn, who goes into a lot of details. It's a really thorough book. Persuasive Pro-Life by Trent Horn, one of the greatest Catholic apologists alive. And Abortion and an Unborn Human Life by Patrick Lee. These are a few books that I would recommend for anyone who's seriously interested on the subject. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Matthieu. I'll give a few comments. I might only go maybe 20 minutes, and then I gotta probably go eat lunch. But yeah, okay. So I'll just give a few comments, and then I'll get into some questions. First off, I think he successfully showed that there are a lot of problematic implications of the pro-choice position. And I think he also showed that there is like a greater kind of simplicity to the pro-life position that is also very inclusive. And to me, I think this would be a desideratum, right? You don't want to make all these arbitrary ad hoc, definitions on what is a human person just so that you can get the desired conclusion that you want, right? It's like, simply put, just saying that a human being and being a moral subject are one and the same, simple, straightforward, and it's inclusive of everybody. You can't subject it to any like serious counterexamples. Like, for instance, the defending abortion on the grounds of, let's say Down syndrome, or even like what that says to people who are born with Down syndrome. And, I mean, obviously you've seen, I think, I forgot who it was, but there was like a Down syndrome gentleman who like spoke to Congress, and he said like, my life is not worth any less because I have Down syndrome, right? I mean, it's really weird because even people who are in the foster care system and they listen to arguments for abortion from like, oh, what if the child's not wanted? I've seen, posts on Twitter where they're like, stop using us as examples to defend abortion, right? Like, my life is not any worth any less because of that. So let me just say a few more things, and I'll ask some questions. So I mean, one thing too is that I think a lot of people are scared of being pro-life, because I mean, some of the admissions that you have of pro-choice philosophers are just incredible. Like what they're admitting, what they're conceding, right, and all this, all that. I remember when I was pro-choice and I was progressive and I started having doubts about, you know, abortion and its legitimacy. But I remembered like it was really the mob mentality of being on the left that made me scared to be pro-life. And so I'm interested in just asking a kind of this first question about like, you know, do you have any advice about how to have the courage to be pro-life, or, you know, like how, like, you know, people don't want to be canceled, but you know, how do you get over that fear, Matthieu, or do you just not have that fear at all?
Well, to be frank, I think we come from very different backgrounds, because I've always been sort of pro-life when I grew up. I think at one point when I was like 15-year-old, I was pro-life, except in the cases of rape.
Sure.
But when I realized this was an irrational position, I changed. And I think that, I mean, what I can tell people is that they should follow the truth wherever it leads, even if the conclusions are not the ones you expect. I mean, this is an intellectual virtue to follow the truth wherever it leads. And if the truth leads to the pro-life position, then you should reconsider your own worldview. And I mean, you should be frankly honest with that. And I think it's sad that in today's society, people don't have this courage to even study the issue. I mean, if you talk with pro-choicers on the streets, it's very rare that you find a pro-choicer who's really knowledgeable on what abortion is, what the methods used are used to perform abortions, what does embryology teach, and they just, statistically, I'm not speaking for everyone, but they don't want to research this information, and they stay in the leftist ideology, being emotional and not really searching for the truth, and that's just sad to see. So yeah.
All right. So one question I have is one thing that might be problematic for your argument, especially when you deal with Thompson style objections, is that you use the concept of intrinsic teleology. And so I don't, you know, obviously I don't reject intrinsic teleology, but just speaking on behalf, like, let's say on behalf of the pro-choice person, right? I mean, so for instance, this is, go to the David Boonin slide a little bit before this one, where he talks about, for instance, you walk in the park, right? And you know that there's a reasonable, I mean, there's a chance, right, that your purse is going to get stolen. But, you know, even though there's this risk, so to speak, you know, you're not, you know, you don't have to face the penalty, right, of like, hey, you went to the park, you knew that your purse might be stolen, and now you have to face the consequences, right, that your purse is stolen. But then you make this distinction between the natural ordering of the sex act, right? So one question is, you know, someone might say it's not relevant, right, that sex is naturally ordered towards procreation, because they might say the analogy still holds, because all you need is just some probability, right, that, you know, you went in knowing that this would probably happen, but just because you went in knowing that this would probably happen, that doesn't mean you can consent to the consequences, or, you know, what follows. You can refuse consent, right? So what's the relevance of the natural ordering to break the analogy?
I guess that it's one aspect of the response, but even if sex was not naturally ordered towards procreation, once you cause someone to be dependent on you. For example, imagine there's a machine that you press on the button, it either gives you $10,000, or you have one chance out of 1,000, it gives you a newborn child. So the machine is not naturally ordered towards giving a newborn child. It's just an artificial machine. But if you press on the button, you have the moral responsibility to take care of the newborn baby that comes out of the machine, if it's the case, if you were unlucky, right? So you can make the argument even without appealing to intrinsic teleology. If you if you cause someone to be dependent on you and you bring out you cause someone to be dependent on your body, then you have to be morally responsible for that. Like that would be like saying, even if you took all the chances, even if you use contraception to say, well, I really didn't want to get pregnant. I took all the necessary means to avoid getting pregnant. I used contraception. I did everything right to lower the probability. Well, you still have to face the consequences if that happens. Suppose you're driving in a car and you have sometimes this tendency to go to sleep when you're driving, and the guy says, well, I drank a lot of coffee to stay awake. I put water on my face. All the necessary things to stay awake while driving, but I still fell asleep and had this car accident. So I'm not responsible for the death of this person because I did all of this to prevent it. Well, no, you're still responsible, even if you did all of this to stop, to lower the probability of the car accident. You still have to be morally accountable for your actions.
Yeah, so it's like if you, well, I think there's two things in that response, right? One is like you knowingly, well, I mean, obviously you knowingly, even if you didn't intentionally, well, you knowingly engaged in an act that would put someone in a dependent state, right? And so even if you intended like all these other things, like, you know, like with the taxi, which is a great example, you know, you try to be as awake as you can or whatever, but like if you really did put them in that state of dependence and they were relying upon you, so to speak, to, you know, to perform properly your action or whatever, then, you know, you're still culpable. You still have a responsibility, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about what else there is. Okay, let me see. Do I have anything else to say? Oh, and then I wanted to also highlight a good point that you made, which is that you brought up the point. I think it's, if you go to the next slide, where, or keep on going, it's the one where you talk about how, like, if he survives, right? If the violinist survives, then it would be a blessing, right there, right there. So I think, I think this is a great example because, you know, so I've heard some pro-choicers kind of disingenuously make this argument, like, oh, well, then let's just not dismember the baby. Let's just have the baby delivered and just kind of abandon him, right? And so we're not intentionally killing the child. We're just kind of letting them die, right? And that's okay, right? And so the thing is that the success of the act, which I think is a part of intention, right? Intention has some kind of inbuilt notion of success. With the case of that, you know, if the violinist were to survive, right, it would be a blessing because we're not intending for him to die, right? That's not the success of the act. The success of the act is just being disconnected, right, without any further action done upon his on the violinist's body. Whereas in the case of just forcing a delivery of a child and then letting that child die, right? If the child survives, as you say, the abortion failed, right? So it's not a success, you know, and so it would violate the intention. So I think that's incredibly relevant. Because, for instance, I don't think you and I would be opposed to, let's say, like a woman doesn't want to be pregnant, right? And maybe she, you know, whatever, she can't really care for the child. So let's say they cause her to deliver the child and the child is kept alive and put up for adoption. I don't think you and I would be opposed to that at all.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not, because in this case, the woman doesn't will her child to die. What's wrong with abortion is the intentional parts. The goal of abortion is to kill.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about if there's anything else I wanted to say here. Oh, and then I just wanted to add that, you know, for us both, the responsibility argument, right, wherein, you know, the woman is culpable or responsible because she has put the child in a dependent state in an action that she knew, you know, could very well lead to someone being in a dependent state, right? We would also say that this applies to the father as well, right? So it's not just one dimensionally, or let's say a double standard just applied to punish the woman or whatever, right?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, well, no, the guy's got a part too, because he engaged in the act and put her in this dependent state as well, or this vulnerable state. And so, we would apply the argument to both individuals. That's correct.
Yeah, he has to pay child support as the father. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, so then I had three last kind of questions or objections, right? So here's the first one. I think you mentioned in the intrinsic teleology PowerPoint or slide, that the uterus is like designed for the fetus, right? And so I know that for a lot of people, I think the main argument for abortion is really a feminist argument, and they're going to say something like, it is unfair that women have been fated to have their bodies designed and used in such a way that, like, for instance, it's unfair that her uterus is for him, but what about her? Why isn't her body for herself, right? And so this is kind of a particular kind of feminist objection, where it seems as if you are saying that some kind of natural inequality is permitted or something like that. How would you respond to that objection?
Well, I would just say, well, you're objecting against nature, and that's I mean, if you don't like nature, that's your problem. But I mean, um, the general principle is this: we should respect the function of our organs ordinarily, and your uterus is pregnancy is not organ donation. You're not donating your uterus to someone, because when you talk of organ donation, you're implying that you're using your organ in an extraordinary way. And this is not the case with pregnancy. So I don't know how you would answer this in another way, because it's just right. If you're angry at nature because women have to bear children, well, that's just the way it is. I don't know how to argue more to someone who objects against nature itself.
Yeah, I mean, because I think that's actually a very common sentiment, among the pro-choice community, and even people like John Rawls, famous liberal political philosopher. He'll talk about how we have to correct the injustices that were there in our birth, or we have to reorder society to make it more fair for everybody. And so for a lot of liberals, they would see abortion as the way in which you make things fair for women,
Yeah.
because it seems as
And
if there's this natural unfairness.
there are also radical pro-choicers on Facebook, for example, who defend that women have no obligation whatsoever to use any part of their bodies for their children. So even breastfeeding their newborns, they say that first they should use formula. And then my objection is that, well, what if there's no formula available? What if the only thing the mother has is her breast? What if she's in prison, or in a country before formula was invented? Now does she have the obligation to feed her child with her breast so that he may not starve to death? And they were consistent. They were saying, no, 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 but absolute bodily autonomy.
Yeah.
And so I mean, you can't, there's a point where you can't argue anymore when you're facing someone who's saying that it's morally okay to let your own child starve to death by refusing your breast. I mean, there's just no point in arguing anymore. I think we've reached the limits.
Yeah, and I'll just say this about like the feminist objection. I think that, as you pointed out before, like a lot of a characteristic of a lot of the bad objections to the pro-life position, they usually dodge the question, right? Of like, okay, is the child, the unborn child, a moral subject, and could there possibly, be a right to like refuse or whatever, and I think you've shown that it's incredibly difficult to justify it, if not impossible, right? And so then the answer is not okay, like I can feel kind of the emotional force of the feminist objection, but I think we have to find a way where both can be true to some extent, right? So like we have to recognize that look, we're in a morally complicated situation where we can't violate a basic axiom of moral reasoning to not directly and voluntarily kill an innocent human being. But look, women also have this desire to have control over their bodies, right? And to not be abandoned and to not be left to fend for themselves and so on and so forth. And so I think the solution, and I like how you, in the end of your presentation, you include like the 4 kind of possible outcomes for the agnostic person and how abortion really is the riskiest of the options available, right? I think what we should do is, you know, like provide, like the state or whatever, we should provide counsel for women, help them, you know, deliver. And then if they want to put their child up for adoption, then let's do that, you know? Or, I mean, I know there are plenty of people who would love to have a child of their own, but can't because they're infertile or whatever, or it's just, you know, so on and so forth. And so I think that the feminist argument goes way too extreme and that there is a happy middle ground to be had. But anyway, here's my last comment. So look, we mentioned the fact that, like, you know, supporting infanticide is just wild, but it's becoming more and more common today. Even when I had the debate between Christopher Kaiser and Ben Watkins was okay with infanticide. He was on the Peter Singer boat. And even, like, you know, on my college campus, I talked to like other, you know, female philosopher friends of mine, and they say they're okay with infanticide. And so it's like, okay, well, this is an intuition that's growing. So this isn't, I don't know if you can, what comments you have on this, but how do you deal with somebody who is totally on like a morally different plane, right? And they're like, yeah, infanticide's okay. You can let your own child die. If he's 5 years old, just abandon him, you know, whatever. Like, I mean, I've heard this kind of stuff. Well, what do you do with that?
I just think there's a limit to rational argumentation, and that people who believe that you can kill your 2-year-old just because he hasn't reached the state of full consciousness or full self-awareness. Um, I mean, well, the only comment I have is that you're just crazy, and I'm not talking to you. Okay, so
Yeah.
this might seem brutal, but I mean, ask everyone, like, do a survey amongst Americans and ask them if they would defend infanticide up to 1 or 2 years after birth. And I would bet you my wallet that less than 1% would defend this position. And so if we could already get 99% of Americans or French people agreeing that um, that defending abortion leads to defending infanticide, since they reject the latter, then we don't need to argue further. It's not going to be a small group of philosophers in academia who are going to change people's um, basic moral intuitions that infanticide is just abhorrent. But I mean, okay, this is always going to be the hyper minority position. And some people have argued very convincingly against infanticide. Christopher Kaiser has a whole chapter on this. But I mean, this chapter is designed for these pro-choice philosophers who go this way, but this is not going to be very useful to the general public who already agrees with this conclusion.
Yeah, well, Matthieu, thank you so much for coming on to my show and talking about a very difficult subject. And I know that you said you're battling a cold or something like that, or do you know what it is exactly?
What?
You said that you were like battling a cold, or you got sick again or something like that.
Yeah, I got sick and my voice hurts a little bit, and my throat hurts a little bit, but it's okay.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you coming out and doing that regardless, giving this talk regardless. And so, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Swan. Thank you.